You have called President Trump's behaviour this morning, rather surprisingly, impressive since he's been in London. But you've also cautioned that his rhetoric can be divisive, hate-filled and antagonistic. So where do you stand on President Trump?
Well, I think even I've got to give credit. In 3.5 years, there's been a day where he's been impressive. I should give credit where it's due. My concern as the Mayor of London is here in the UK, we feel the long shadow of Donald Trump's agenda, but also how the rise of the far right extends beyond the USA and is felt here. So we see it, for example, in the fact that you've got politicians in the UK and those in the far right copying Donald Trump. We see in Hungary, in Italy, in Poland, in France, members of the far right movement, people who support populist nativism, having Donald Trump as their poster boy. And it's a huge source of concern for me as the mayor of the most diverse city in the world who believes in pluralism and liberal values.
Which politicians in the UK do you see as copying President Trump in those respects?
Well, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage. We see on the extreme far right parties who have been banned, like Britain First, having their tweets retweeted by Donald Trump. You've got leaders of far right movements here in the UK who are deemed to be racist, having Donald Trump as their poster boy. We've seen leaders in Hungary and Poland using really disparaging language, demonizing immigrants and minority communities, having Donald Trump as their poster boy. We see it in France, we see it in other parts of Europe. And I think what people in the USA may not realize is when you are president of a wonderful country like the USA, the most diverse multicultural country in the world, to have your president saying things like he said, doing things like he's done, causes many of us huge concern.
Since you've been mayor, have you detected an increase or a difference in the demonisation of immigrants or minorities in the capital here in the UK?
Oh, without doubt. We've seen a demonisation of not just minorities, but immigrants. We've seen an increase in hate crime. I'm not saying all of it lays at the door of Donald Trump, but I tell you this, there are people here who mimic him and copy him, and he gives them succor. He gives them confidence and views that used to be in the periphery. People who used to be in the margins are now in the mainstream. And you see some of the languages used by our own mainstream politicians. They've seen that Donald Trump's playbook leads to electoral success, and they're using the same tactics here in the UK. They're using the same tactics, by the way, in Hungary, look at Orban. In Poland, look at Duda. In Italy, look at Salvini. In France, look at Le Pen. So these are people who've seen that the sort of methods used by this man lead to electoral success. So the ends are successful, but the means lead to fears being stoked against minority communities. They've led to a rise in hate crime. And it's the very opposite of what NATO was all about, the very opposite of what the EU was all about, the very opposite of the multilateralism that the US and the UK have led on for the last 70 years.
And I'll get to NATO in just a second, but what do you think is going on in society, let's speak specifically about the UK obviously because that's where we are, that means that those types of characters, those politicians with their previously fringe beliefs, demonising minorities and immigrants, why does that lead to electoral success in the United Kingdom?
Well, I think what you're seeing is around the world, people who aren't seeing the fruits of globalisation, who are concerned about the fact that their lives aren't improving. And what they're seeing is politicians who are playing on their fears, playing on their anxieties, rather than addressing their fears and their anxieties. So if, for example, you as a politician blame the other for the reason why you can't get a decent job, blame the other for the reason why you can't get decent healthcare or why you can't get decent schools, it's quite tempting and intoxicating to believe that because you're being sold a pup. And so the challenge I'd say to us politicians who are pluralistic and progressives is we've got to address people's concerns and make sure we realise that there's a vacuum that's been filled by people like Donald Trump and Salvini and Duda and Orban and Johnson and Farage. And the bad news is that has led to electoral success around the world, and Donald Trump is their poster boy.
With the NATO meeting that's happening at the moment for the 70th anniversary, there's been a lot of discussion about the evolution of the threats that are facing NATO countries and how that can be addressed. Chief among them is Islamic fundamentalism and radicalisation, and obviously we have seen that on the streets of London. Do you feel like NATO needs to do more than it's currently doing to combat those threats?
One of the things that NATO is doing is looking at the whole issue of terrorism and countering terrorism. They've got forces deployed in Afghanistan and in Iraq really important. One of the reasons why it causes us concern is when the President of the USA calls NATO obsolete or makes threats to leave NATO because it's so important. We should all be worried about terrorism and extremism, not just from so-called Islamist groups, but also from the extreme far right. We saw in a synagogue in America the consequences of the far right going to synagogue and killing innocent Jewish men, and when we've seen in Christchurch in New Zealand the consequences of the extreme far right going into a mosque. We saw in Finsbury Park in 2017 the far right, but also we see Islamist terrorists as well, motivated by a perverse form of Islam. We saw unfortunately last Friday in London Bridge this terrorist responsible for 2 deaths. And so I think we've got to make sure we work together. That's a good example of the sort of threat that can only be dealt with across borders, whether it's terrorism, whether it's migration from the Southern Hemisphere, that's a big source of concern, whether it's climate change. These sorts of challenges are cross-border. And that's why it's so important for the leader of the USA to not give the impression that he's going to be protectionist. And the concern we have is when President Trump talks about America first, does he really mean white America first? And that's a big concern for many of us.
Do you think he does mean white America first?
Well, I think you judge somebody by what they say and by what they do. And as far as we can see from London, President Trump has said on many, many occasions and done things on many, many occasions that give us a huge source of concern and gives us the impression that all he cares about is white America. When we hear a mainstream politician, when you see the president of the most diverse country in the world whipping up a crowd into a frenzy, so they say, quote unquote, send them back, against 4 politicians who are politicians of colour. When you see a politician, sorry, not a politician, but the president of the USA calling people rapists because they happen to be Mexican, or having a travel ban against people of my faith, that leads to huge concerns across the world.
Now, you're obviously a member of the Labour Party, and that's a party that you stand for. Given that there's been 9 years of austerity under the Conservatives, and they are still currently leading in the polls, as unpredictable as they can be, do you attribute some of the lack of success that the Labour Party is currently having to the leadership? Because Jeremy Corbyn himself has come under quite a lot of criticism, particularly around issues of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Well,
there's a number of issues there. Firstly, there is an issue with the Labour Party not addressing serious concerns around anti-Semitism of members of the Labour Party quickly enough. Anti-Semitism is racism. We can't have a hierarchy of racism. Racism is racism. And we're a party whose roots are anti-racist. It is the case, though, and it breaks my heart to say this, that we've been too slow. Many of my Jewish friends have said they can't vote Labour because they think we're racist. And we've got to address those concerns. We can't deflect because people's motivation may be anti-Labour. These are genuine concerns people have. There's a second issue about the polls, which frankly speaking aren't looking good for my party. Let's wait and see how the general election pans out. There are still a number of days to go. Like many Labour members, supporters, activists, I'm spending a lot of time knocking on doors trying to persuade people to lend us their vote, making the point that the choice this election is between a Brexit-backing, austerity-loving Conservative Party or a Labour government that will give the British public a final say on whether we should stay or leave the European Union now that we know what it entails, but also end austerity once and for all. And it's the big choice people have to make on December the 12th.
Are you happy with the direction of the Labour Party that you see it's travelling in?
Well, I think we've got a big election on December the 12th. We want to win that general election. I'm the Mayor of London. My job is to govern for London. Sometimes that means working with a Conservative government. Sometimes it means challenging a Labour Party I belong to. My job as the Mayor of London is to do what's best in my city's interests. And, I've had issues I've raised publicly and privately about my party. Similarly, I have issues I've raised publicly and privately with the Conservative government. I've got to be a mayor for all Londoners.
Finally, Jack Merritt's father, one of the victims of the terror attack last Friday, has cautioned against politicising the incident and using it as an excuse to advocate for harsher sentencing. But as Mayor of London, what do you think needs to be done in order to protect the citizens of the capital?
Well, the first point I'd make is we saw last Friday the very worst of humanity in this terrorist, but also we saw the very best of humanity. And Jack and Saskia dedicated their lives at a young age to helping other people. It's quite inspirational. We saw brave Londoners, ordinary Londoners, go above and beyond to stop further people being the victims of this terrorist. I think There are important lessons we have to learn. We've got to make sure we avoid a situation where somebody who's clearly a danger to the public appears to have been released and not properly supervised. There are big questions that need to be asked. There is an investigation that's live and there are reviews taking place, so I don't want to breach any confidences. But I think the legitimate questions that the public are asking, I'm asking, that deserve answers. There's a separate issue about not having a knee-jerk response. One of the temptations for politicians is to respond in a knee-jerk fashion to an atrocity. We shouldn't do that, but I think it's important that we do reflect if any lessons can be learned.
Sadiq Khan, thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.